take us back, if you will, to this day a year ago and how you felt.
Caroline, I was sitting in my office in the Khanna building, and then we heard that we needed to evacuate because there was a bomb threat. And so I left my office. I started walking towards the Capitol, and then my phone was flooded with text messages saying, "Don't go to the Capitol, it's being overrun." I didn't understand what people meant that it was being overrun, but I came back to this office that I'm in now, the Khanna office building. We ignored basically the bomb threats. And I locked the doors and was here till midnight. And then the speaker called for us at midnight to vote. And it was a real moment of pride that we could still vote for President Biden and Kamala Harris to affirm democracy.
Congressman, of course, I'm sure from your perspective, you were torn because this is a moment where many laid blame at the feet of some companies, which you are within your representative area, which were born in California. Many wanted more strides to be taken to suppress this sort of ability to incite violence through the spread of arrangements online. How do you grade the likes of Facebook, the likes of Twitter, the likes of the publicly traded larger social media platforms that some feel had some role to play in this day last year?
I'm very proud of representing Silicon Valley, but I agree with the critics that these companies, particularly Facebook, are to blame. I mean, I read reporting on The Ugly Truth by two journalists that Facebook basically was sitting on information that their private security had said there are going to be assassination attempts. We're monitoring this online. And the decision was made not to report that to law enforcement, not to provide any warning. That is wrong. Let me be very clear. The First Amendment does not protect the right to incite violence. It does not protect the right to plan assassinations. And these companies need to do a much better job in monitoring and removing threats of violence and alerting law enforcement about them.
To that end, many would say that these companies have invested a significant amount in so doing. They're using algorithms, they're using people, but it is a game of whack-a-mole. There are just too many people, too much information out there to bring down. How do you feel about that? Could more strides be made?
Of course, in this case, there was a conscious decision that Facebook made not to report the information. They knew where the information was. I mean, give me a break. If these companies can micro-target people based on their preferences and have the sophisticated algorithms to do that, they certainly have the ability to remove threats of violence, incitement to violence, or blatantly racist posts. And some of the things that they have up there, again, don't meet the Brandenburg First Amendment test. So they can do better from a legal perspective, and they need to do better from a sense of what is in the public discourse and creating a strong public discourse. The idea that you can just have people congregate and talk and somehow that's going to create peace and mutual understanding is so naive. If it were that easy, we wouldn't need political philosophy or democratic theory. They have to really take more classes in philosophy and ethics and journalism and really be more reflective about their role as stakeholders in democracy.
Let's talk about that role, because in many ways, leaders of such businesses don't want to have to play that role. They don't feel it's part of a company's right or authority to do so. Is it going to take regulation? Is it going to take some other area of force? Because they could certainly be pushed into committing more capital to work, but what about the role in which they have in terms of taking down such information?
Well, absolutely, it's going to take regulation to have more competition, regulation to not have them manipulate data in the way they are, regulation to have basic consumer safety. But it's also going to take ethics. You know, the famous philosopher Jürgen Habermas said of newspapers that they have a commercial basis, but they're not fully commercialized. By that, he meant newspapers had developed an ethic of informing the citizenry and didn't just care about the bottom line. We need to see that kind of ethics develop in social media, that it's not simply about shareholder maximization, but a look at what is their obligation to creating a fair public square.
To that end, I mean, how does the FBI balance this to a certain extent of stop, or how does the government, how does anyone prevent these attacks from happening, but allowing discourse to take place on such platforms?
Well, the same way we do in a town hall. You know, I have town halls every month in my district, and we have a wonderful discussion. And there are Republicans who stand up and say that I'm totally messing up and criticize me and don't hold back. But you know what? We have police officers there to make sure no one is threatening violence. And we make sure that you raise your hand when you speak and you don't shout over others. So we know how to do this as a country. This is not something new in terms of having a public sphere where everyone is equal and where you don't have the rampant sexism or racism. I just think we need to be more reflective on social media platforms.
Many would say, indeed, the leaders of the largest social media platforms would say this is just being driven onto other areas of discourse, the likes other social media platforms that aren't as large and aren't as overlooked and overseen. Do you see that happening, and how do we prevent just driving it underground, but it's still occurring?
Good, yes, they're right. But I'd rather it be driven in niche corners rather than mainstream. I mean, the reality is if you're on NBC or ABC or the New York Times, that matters more than if you're in some niche space. And what has happened is a lot of these niche movements of hate and anger have become mainstream on these huge social media platforms. So if they say, yes, we can eliminate hate, of course we can. But there's a difference between having it be mainstream and having it in dark niche corners. And I much rather it be in niche corners than mainstream and amplified the way it currently is.
Congressman, you're saying you're having town halls, you're having discourse among the voting public of your of the area with which you represent. But tell us about what the business leaders have been telling you. What was the temperature like at that moment in Silicon Valley as to how culpable they were or were not?
There's an understanding of reflection of their role. I think one of the most thoughtful, two people I'd say are very thoughtful, Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn, really reflective about this. Tim Cook, you know, I often quote, it's his commencement speech is worth reading at Stanford, where he says, we can't be human if everything is known about us, and we have an obligation to really be responsible with data. So you have people, of course, on his wall, he admires Gandhi and John Lewis. So you have people in the Valley who are very thoughtful, very reflective. But what we need to make sure is that there is a serious and broader conversation across technology platforms. They've done a lot of good. I'm proud of representing the area, but they have a much bigger obligation to 21st century democracy.
And talk to us about your obligation now and your role, a representative's role, to make law. What is the legislative outlook for 2022, which you think could bring to bear some positive change for these social media platforms?
Well, we have to do two things. First of all, by 2025, we're going to have 25 million digital jobs in this country. That's more than manufacturing and construction combined. We need to make sure rural America, Black and brown communities have access to modern prosperity, that young people across this country have the ability to have opportunities in the jobs of the future. And second, we need to make sure we have an Internet Bill of Rights. I worked on this with Tim Berners-Lee, that has sensible regulations on data, so our data can't be used and then targeted for purposes we don't consent to, and that has basic consumer safety standards. I mean, the idea, again, with Facebook, that they are using a platform that is causing anxiety, depression, and suicide amongst teenagers, how are we allowing that? We would never allow that for any other product. That's not about, again, the First Amendment. That's about consumer safety products. So we need regulation and the distribution of opportunity.